In 2018, researchers Josh Cuevas and Brian Dawson pitted two theories of learning against each other: the theory of learning styles and the theory of dual coding. Learning styles suggests that we all have a preferred mode of learning, perhaps visual or auditory or reading and writing or kinesthetic, and that we learn best when the learning conditions match that particular mode. Dual coding, on the other hand, suggests that learning outcomes are improved when there's a blend of verbal and visual processing of new information. So here's what they did to test these two theories. They decided to focus on two styles of learning. They focused on visual learners and auditory learners. And they set up 4 different groups, 2 with each style. So these are our visual learners. These are auditory learners based on their preferred learning style. Then each group was presented with some new information, but the different groups were asked to process that information in different ways. One group was asked to rate how easily they could pronounce the words in the statements they were hearing. The other group was asked how easily they could form a mental picture or image based on the statements. And those two types of processing were repeated for the auditory learners as well. One group of auditory learners was encouraged to process that information verbally, the other to process it visually. So these here are the learning conditions for each of those 4 groups. And then after hearing and processing 20 different statements, they were quizzed to see if they could recall specific details from each scenario as a way of tracking what percent of that information they were able to remember. So what we're getting at here is the learning outcome. And what they found was that for the visual learners, those encouraged to process verbally remembered about 40% of the details they were asked about, whereas visual learners encouraged to process information visually, matching up their learning style, that group was able to recall about 80% of the details. So far that makes sense. That's in alignment with both learning styles and dual coding, but it's with the 2 auditory groups where it gets interesting. The auditory learners who processed information verbally retained about the same information as the visual learners processing verbally, around 40%. But then those auditory learners who were encouraged to process the information visually also achieved about 80% recall. So despite the fact that there was a mismatch between their supposed learning style and the learning condition, they still achieved better learning outcomes when encouraged to process that information visually. So it's this result right here that lends support to the idea, the theory of dual coding, suggesting that it's helpful for all learners, no matter their learning preference, to weave together verbal and visual when processing new information. And this is one study that has contributed to a trend away from the idea of learning styles. It's been fairly debunked at this point, the idea that you have to match up an individual's preferred mode of learning with the actual learning conditions. Instead, there's strong support for the theory of dual coding, that it's good for the brain to bring visuals in because we're visual creatures, but it's also worth paying attention to the specific skill that you're developing. In this case, it was just about remembering ideas that you heard. If we're talking about a music class, it makes sense to lean into auditory learning conditions. If it's a shop class, kinesthetic. If it's a geography class, much more visual. So while there is strong evidence that processing new information visually is a great way to remember more of that information, do pay attention to the actual skill that you're trying to develop. So one way to interpret the results of this study is by recognizing that you're not a visual learner. We're all visual learners. And if this particular mode of learning and of processing information is a skill that you'd like to develop, check out the resources at verbaltovisual.com. In particular, I've developed a program called SketchEd to make it easier for middle school and high school teachers in particular to bring visual note-taking into the classroom to teach your students these skills and tap into those full benefits of dual coding. Within that program, you'll find some ready for the classroom video lessons and follow-up activities that teach the basics of sketchnoting to your students so that they can then apply those skills to whatever content you're teaching that day, which will definitely get the visual learners in your classroom excited, but will also support those who maybe prefer auditory learning experiences. They'll get the chance to see that, hey, working with visuals supports their learning too. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.